Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching the rain fall in soft sheets outside. The world felt distant today, as if it was pressing in on her, trying to remind her of the emptiness that had taken over her life. It had been 5 years since. Her father, Captain Michael Hawkins, had disappeared during a deep space mission. His ship, the Aquila, had simply gone silent. No distress signal, no final message, just an eerie void of nothingness. She glanced at the clock, 4:45 p.m. Evelyn, her mother, was in the living room, but Sarah didn't want to disturb her just yet. Evelyn had spent so many nights in tears after Michael's disappearance. There were no bodies, no wreckage, just a cold, lifeless silence. No closure, nothing to hold on to. "Dinner's almost ready, Sarah," her mother called from the other room, breaking her thoughts. "Thanks, Mom," Sarah replied softly, turning away from the window. As much as she wanted to escape, she couldn't. Not tonight. Not again. Every night her mother would try to keep their routines, but it was getting harder to pretend everything was okay. The sudden sound of the doorbell cut through her thoughts, unexpected and sharp. Who could that be? Evelyn asked, frowning as she walked toward the door. The rain was still pouring outside, so it was unlikely anyone would be out there unless they had a good reason. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was a friend from the old days, someone who knew about her father. She followed her mother toward the door, a mix of hope and dread flooding her chest. Evelyn opened the door, and Sarah froze in place. A man stood there, drenched from the rain, his hair dark and tousled. His eyes locked onto Evelyn's with a familiarity that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. The man's face was startlingly young, no older than 30. He wasn't tall or imposing like Michael had been. He was ordinary. Almost too ordinary. "Can I help you?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. "Slightly." The man took a step forward, his eyes soft but serious. "Mom," he said, his voice cracked but familiar. "It's me, Michael." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her mother's eyes widened in disbelief. "Michael? But how?" Evelyn's voice faltered as she stepped back, clearly, confused by the sight of the young man who stood before her. Sarah wanted to move, to say something, but her feet were frozen in place. This man, this boy, couldn't be her father. It wasn't possible. Her father had been gone for 5 years. He had been lost to the stars. She had seen the reports. She had seen the news stories, the endless theories of what might have happened. But this wasn't her father. This couldn't be him. Evelyn reached out slowly, her hands shaking, and placed them on the man's face, as if searching for some sign that she wasn't imagining it. "Michael?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" The man, her father, nodded. "It's really me, Mom. I'm sorry. I know this is all so sudden. I don't really know how it happened. I was lost. And now I'm here." Sarah could only stare. The man in front of her was the image of a younger Michael, but it couldn't be him. It just couldn't. "Sarah." The man's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "You've grown so much. He stopped, looking down at the ground as though unsure of how to continue. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. You look like him," Sarah managed to say, her throat tight. "But you can't be him. My father, he's gone. He's gone. This isn't possible." The man, Michael, took a step closer to Sarah. His eyes were full of sadness, and for a moment it seemed as though he might break down in front of her. "I know it's hard to understand," he said, his voice low. "I don't understand it either. But something went wrong. I came back. I don't know how. But I'm here. And I remember everything." Evelyn's hands, trembled as she wiped a tear from her cheek. She looked from Sarah to the man in front of them, her face etched with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Michael, my God, you look so young. But how is this possible? You were older when you left. You were older." "I don't know," Michael said, shaking his head. "I don't have all the answers. I was in deep space near this anomaly we were supposed to study. There was an explosion of some sort. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was here, and I was young again. I don't know how, I just don't." The room felt too small, the air too thick. Sarah couldn't breathe. This wasn't her father. Her father was a man in his late 40s, tough and strong, who had spent years in the military and as a space explorer. The man standing in front of them wasn't even close. He was just a boy. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. But he had the same eyes, the same voice, and something in the way he stood. Something familiar. Maybe it was him. Maybe... "You must have questions," Michael said, breaking Sarah's thoughts. "I don't blame you, but I'm here now. I've come back. And we need to figure out what happened, together." Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to scream, to shout at him that this couldn't be real. But what good would it do? What could she say? There were too many questions, too many things that didn't make sense. "Mom," Michael said, turning to Evelyn, "can I come? Inside?" "I don't know where else to go." Evelyn nodded slowly, stepping aside to let him in. "Of course," she whispered. "You're home, Michael. You're home." But Sarah couldn't move. She stood frozen in place, staring at the man who had once been her father, unsure of what to believe. As Michael stepped inside, Evelyn closed the door behind him. The sound echoed in Sarah's ears. It wasn't just the door closing, it was the past. It was the life she had once known, and everything was changing. This was her father. But he was different, and Sarah didn't know if she was ready to accept that. The next few days were a blur for Sarah. She tried to make sense of everything that had happened, but no matter how hard she thought about it, there was no way to explain her father's return. Michael, her father, was now a young man again. Not the older, battle-worn figure she remembered. His hair was dark and free from the gray streaks it once had. His face was smooth, unmarked by time, and his eyes, though still familiar, were somehow different. He was still her father, but at the same time, he was someone new. Every time she looked at him, it felt like a wave of confusion hit her chest. She couldn't decide whether she wanted to hug him or run away. How could this happen? How could her father just return, looking 20 years younger, without any warning? In the mornings, Michael would sit at the kitchen table, awkwardly trying to interact with Sarah and her mother. He wasn't the man he had been before. He had no idea what was going on in the world. He had no idea what had changed in the years he was gone. Everything felt like a strange dream that wouldn't wake up. Evelyn tried her best to make Michael feel welcome, cooking his favorite meals, asking him questions about his time in space, but it was clear that something was missing. The warmth, the connection. Everything felt like it had slipped through their fingers. "I remember," Michael would say, his voice trailing off as though he were trying to catch a memory. "I remember the mission, but it's all a blur. The last thing I recall was seeing a bright light. And then, I woke up here, back home, in this body." Sarah watched him closely. His eyes would flicker with a hint of sadness, a longing for answers he couldn't find. Sometimes she could see the struggle on his face, as if he was trying to hold on to pieces of himself that kept slipping away. One evening, after dinner, when the three of them were sitting in the living room, Sarah decided she had to get some answers. She could no longer live in this state of confusion. She had to know what had happened to her father. "I'm going to find out what really happened," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I can't keep living in the dark like this. I need to know what changed." Evelyn, who had been quietly observing, looked at her daughter with concern. "What do you mean, Sarah? You know, Michael." "I know what I see now," Sarah cut in, her voice firm. "But what I remember is different. I need to understand why he's here like this. Why he's young, Mom. This isn't normal." Evelyn opened her mouth to protest, but hesitated. She knew deep down that Sarah was right. There were too many unanswered questions. "Please be careful," Evelyn said softly, her voice betraying the worry she felt. "I don't want you getting mixed up in anything dangerous." Sarah nodded, but determination set in her eyes. She was going to find the truth, even if it meant going through the past, no matter how painful. The next morning, Sarah went to the local library. She dug through old space mission reports, records from the space agency her father had worked with. She contacted some of her father's old colleagues, hoping they could shed some light on what had happened. After hours of sifting through data, Sarah found something that sent a cold shiver down her spine. A classified report from the Aquila's mission, marked Top Secret. The report described a cosmic anomaly near a distant star, something the crew had never encountered before. It wasn't just a black hole or a wormhole, it was something different, something that twisted the very fabric of time itself. The report described how the crew had gone through this anomaly and experienced strange effects. Time seemed to slow down, distort, even loop in some places. Some crew members reported seeing strange visions, while others felt like they were losing themselves. But what caught Sarah's eye was the final entry in the report. It was a message from her father, Captain Michael Hawkins. "Something's wrong. We've passed through a time dilation. I can't explain it, but I feel younger. We need to return home. This could change everything." That was it. The message ended there, and the rest of the report was redacted. Sarah's heart raced as she stared at the screen, her fingers trembling on the keyboard. This was it. This was the explanation. The anomaly had somehow reversed time for her father. It was as though he had been pulled through time, his body, aged backward, leaving him in the form of a younger version of himself. She didn't know what to think. A time anomaly? It was a concept that sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. But it made sense. It was the only thing that could explain what had happened to Michael. But if time could be changed, manipulated, what else had changed? What other consequences had the anomaly caused? Sarah needed to know more. She couldn't let her father live in confusion, or worse, be used by whoever had created the anomaly. She made up her mind. She was going to find the people responsible for this, and she wasn't going to stop until she had the answers she needed. That night, after dinner, Sarah sat down with Michael. He was trying to adjust to his new life, but the awkwardness between them was still palpable. It wasn't just his age that had changed. Everything had. His knowledge of the world was out of date, and his experience seemed to have vanished. The man who had been a hero in Sarah's eyes was now a stranger. "Dad," Sarah began, her voice soft but firm, "I found something today. A report about your mission. It talks about the anomaly, the one you passed through. It explains what happened. It says you came back younger." Michael blinked, his brow furrowing. "You found the report? So, it's real? I wasn't imagining it?" "No," Sarah said, "it's real. The time anomaly. It caused you to age backward, to come back looking like this. But there's more, Dad. There's a lot more that we don't understand yet. I think there are people out there who know more than they're telling us." Michael stood up, pacing the room as he processed this information. "I never thought something like this could happen, but it makes sense. I've felt off. Not just physically, but mentally too. My mind's still catching up with my body. I remember everything, but it feels like it's from someone else's life. Sarah's heart ached as she saw the confusion in his eyes. Her father wasn't just physically different. He was a man caught between two worlds, two realities. "I'm going to figure this out, Dad," Sarah said, her voice resolute. "I won't let anyone use you or this anomaly. I'll find the truth. We'll fix this." Michael nodded, his eyes tired but thankful. "I don't know how to thank you, Sarah, but I trust you. I know you'll get us the answers we need." Sarah felt the weight of the journey ahead of her. The answers were out there, but so were the dangers. And no matter what, she couldn't let her father become a pawn in someone else's game. The following week was filled with uncertainty. Sarah had barely slept, spending every waking moment digging deeper into the mystery of the anomaly. The more she uncovered, the more questions arose. She discovered that her father's ship, the Akala, had been one of the first to study the time dilation anomaly, but the mission's records were oddly incomplete. No one had ever really explained the full scope of the event. It was as if someone wanted it hidden. Michael, for his part, seemed to be adjusting, though the process was slow. He still had moments where he couldn't understand the current world around him. He'd often stare at his phone, confused by the technology that had changed in the 5 years he'd been gone. Simple tasks like making a phone call or using the internet were foreign to him. One morning, Sarah found him in the living room, staring at a television screen with a puzzled look. A commercial for a new car model was playing, and Michael was watching it like it was the most complicated thing he had ever seen. "Dad?" Sarah asked, stepping into the room. "You okay?" Michael turned to her, his expression blank. "I don't understand. How is it that they're selling cars like this now? I remember when we were just getting electric cars, but now they look like they can fly." Sarah smiled softly, trying to hide her own frustration. "The world's changed, Dad. You've been gone for 5 years. A lot can happen in that time." He shook his head, still looking at the screen. "I know. It just doesn't feel like I was gone that long. It feels like yesterday. I was still on the Aquila, talking to the crew, preparing for the mission. Now, I'm here, in this body." It was hard for Sarah to watch. Her father was struggling with more than just adjusting to the world. He was trying to adjust to a body that didn't match his mind, to a life that didn't make sense anymore. She couldn't even imagine what that felt like. The loss of time, the loss of identity. But Sarah had no choice but to keep moving forward. She had made a promise to find out what happened, and she couldn't back down now. If the truth was going to be ugly, so be it. She had to know. Later that week, Sarah received a strange call. It was from a number she didn't recognize. But when she answered, the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Sarah Hawkins." The voice was calm but cold. "We know what you've been looking into. We suggest you stop, for your father's sake." "Who is this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "What do you want?" "Just a warning. There are people involved in the anomaly. People who don't take kindly to interference. If you keep digging, you won't like what you find." The line went dead before Sarah could respond. She stared at her phone, feeling a chill creep up her spine. There was no question anymore. Someone or some group was behind the anomaly. They had been watching her every move. She didn't want to believe it, but she knew this wasn't just a coincidence. She wasn't the only one searching for answers. And whoever was behind this anomaly had no intention of letting anyone expose the truth. Later that evening, Michael came to Sarah with a question that sent a jolt through her chest. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need to know something. I feel like something's wrong. With me. With my memory. It's as if I've forgotten something important. Like I'm missing a piece of the puzzle." Sarah looked up from her work, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. She knew it wasn't just his adjustment to the younger body that troubled him. It was something deeper, something he couldn't put into words. And now, it seemed that the missing piece of the puzzle was becoming clearer. "Dad, I think you're right," Sarah said carefully, setting down the paper she was looking through. "There's something more going on. I've been looking into your mission, and I found something disturbing. It's not just the anomaly. There's more to it." Michael stepped forward, his eyes intense. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated. She had uncovered the reports, the classified ones about the experimentations with the time anomaly. The more she read, the more she understood that the Aquila's mission wasn't just about research. It was a testing ground for something far darker. And her father? He wasn't just a victim of the anomaly. He was chosen, a part of a larger experiment by a secret group within the space agency. She didn't know how or why, but she knew now that her father's return wasn't a random accident. There's a group, somewhere in the government, who's been experimenting with time, manipulating it, trying to control it, Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I think you were part of that. I think they made sure you came back, but not by accident. They wanted you to." Michael looked as though he was struck by a thunderclap. "What are you saying, Sarah? That I wasn't just a victim? That I was part of something?" "Planned?" She nodded. "I don't have all the answers yet, but it's the only thing that makes sense. Your return, the way you came back younger, it wasn't random. They knew what was happening. They were controlling it. And now, I think they're watching us." Michael clenched his fists. "So, they've been playing with us, playing with me, for their own twisted purposes. I was the experiment." His voice broke for a moment, a sign of the anger and pain he was feeling. It wasn't just about the physical transformation, it was the betrayal of it all. A life stolen from him, a future erased, and a new version of himself forced upon him. "We have to stop them," Michael said finally, his voice steadying. "They've taken too much already. They can't take more." Sarah felt a surge of determination fill her chest. "We'll stop them, I promise. I don't know how, but we will." Over the next few days, Sarah and Michael carefully laid out their plan. They knew the government wouldn't just let them walk away with the truth. Whoever was behind this anomaly had power, and they wouldn't hesitate to use it. They needed allies, and they needed information. As Sarah reached out to more of her father's old contacts, she realized that they weren't the only ones being watched. There were others, other people whose lives had been affected by similar experiments, some who had suffered and others who had come out, changed. It wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a fight for survival. And Sarah, with her father by her side, was determined to expose the truth. But as they moved forward, one thing was clear. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it would get. The following days felt like a constant battle. Sarah and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, followed by invisible eyes. Every movement, every conversation seemed to be observed. The strange phone call from the mysterious voice haunted Sarah's thoughts. It was clear now. Someone was behind the anomaly, and they wouldn't stop until they silenced anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Michael had become more restless. He no longer seemed like the same man Sarah remembered from her childhood. He was now a young man, caught between the memories of his former life and the reality of what he had become. He had more questions than answers, and every day the confusion seemed to grow. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She knew they had to uncover the truth. The reports she had found had already set the pieces in motion. She couldn't let them be taken from her, not when she was so close to the answers. But with the dangers growing closer, it wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about surviving. It all started with a knock on the door. It was late in the evening when Sarah heard it. The knock was sharp, deliberate, but muffled by the rain that poured steadily outside. She stiffened at the sound, heart racing. No one should have been at their door at this hour. The government agents, whoever they were, had been getting closer, and she could feel the tension in the air. "Mom, stay back," Sarah whispered to Evelyn, who was sitting in the living room reading. Evelyn looked at her, a questioning expression on her face, but Sarah shook her head. "Stay quiet. I'll check." Evelyn hesitated but nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah slowly crept toward the door, trying to peer through the peephole. What she saw made her blood run cold. Two men stood on the porch, dressed in dark, nondescript clothes. They didn't look like typical government agents. There was something off about them. Something cold. "They know we're here," Sarah muttered under her breath, backing away from the door. She turned toward Michael, who had been standing nearby, silently watching. He knew the danger too. "We have to leave," Sarah said urgently. "Now!" Michael didn't hesitate. The familiar, confident man he had once been was still there, buried deep inside the youthful version of himself. He stood straight, his eyes scanning the room as if he were already in the middle of a military operation. It was clear that the man she knew hadn't completely disappeared. And now, more than ever, she needed him to be the leader he once was. They grabbed their coats and made their way out the back door as quietly as possible. Evelyn was still frozen in fear, but Sarah took her mother's hand and pulled her along. "We can't stay here," Sarah said. "They'll be looking for us. We need to go. We need to disappear." It wasn't long before they were on the run. They took a detour through the woods behind their house, away from the main roads. Michael led the way, guiding them through the dense trees. His youth seemed to give him more energy, but it was still hard for Sarah to ignore the fact that her father's mind didn't match his new body. They had to be careful. Every step was one more step away from everything they knew. As they traveled deeper into the forest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The air felt thicker, as if the trees themselves were closing in on them, blocking their way. Her heart pounded in her chest as they moved in silence, trying to stay out of sight. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a twig beneath their feet, made Sarah tense. "I think we're being followed," Sarah whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "They're close." Michael's expression tightened. He was alert, scanning the surroundings, but he didn't speak. His experience told him to stay quiet, to move faster. They couldn't afford to be caught. But it was too late. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind them. "Stop! We know you're out there!" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was the same voice that had warned her to stop digging. The same voice from the phone call. The words chilled her to the bone. "Run!" Michael shouted, his voice hoarse but commanding. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her forward, urging her to move faster. "Don't look back. We can't let them catch us." They ran, the trees blurred around them as they pushed through the thick underbrush. Every footstep was heavy, every movement desperate. Sarah's legs burned, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't afford to. Her father was right beside her, and Evelyn was close behind. They had to make it out of the forest. They had to get away from whoever was chasing them. They broke through the trees and found themselves in a clearing. Sarah's eyes quickly scanned the area, looking for a way out, but there was nothing but more trees and the distant sound of rushing water. She knew they couldn't stop. They had to keep moving. "They'll be on us in minutes," Sarah panted, her chest heaving. "We need to find a place to hide." "Not yet," Michael said, his voice firm. "We keep moving. If we stop now, they'll catch us. We need to get to the safe house." "Safe house?" Sarah asked, her mind racing. "You have a place like that?" Michael nodded. "I set it up years ago before the mission, just in case something went wrong. It's a secure location far from here. We can lay low, gather our strength, and figure out what to do next." Sarah's heart leapt at the thought of a safe place, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Even if they made it to the safe house, they weren't out of danger. They had to stay one step ahead, always. The people after them were powerful. and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. For hours, they kept running, moving through the dense woods, only stopping to catch their breath when absolutely necessary. Sarah's legs ached, and the weight of the situation hung heavily on her shoulders. They couldn't keep this up forever. They needed to find shelter soon. Finally, they reached the edge of the forest. The safe house was only a short distance away now, but Sarah could already hear the sounds of footsteps behind them, growing closer. The pursuers weren't far behind. They had to make it to the house before it was too late. "Almost there," Michael said, his voice strained but determined. They reached the clearing just as the sound of footsteps grew louder. The shadows of their pursuers stretched behind them, moving closer with each passing second, but Michael pushed them forward faster than ever. "We're almost there," he shouted, and then, with a final burst of energy, they reached the safe house. The door creaked open and they slipped inside just as their pursuers reached the clearing. Breathing heavily, Sarah slammed the door shut behind them, locking it. They were safe, for now, but she knew this was only the beginning. The real fight had just begun. The safe house was exactly as Michael had promised, a small, isolated cabin hidden deep within a secluded forest. The walls were sturdy, the windows tightly shut, and the only sound that reached them was the occasional wind rustling through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Inside, Sarah, Michael, and Evelyn sat around a small wooden table. Sarah's mind was racing. They had made it to safety, but only temporarily. They couldn't stay here forever. The people after them were relentless. The longer they stayed, the more likely they were to be discovered. There was no time to waste. They had to find answers, and they had to do it fast. Michael had been pacing, lost in thought, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. The same confusion, the same frustration that had haunted him since his return lingered in his eyes. He was still trying to make sense of everything. His body was young again, but his mind was caught in the past, struggling to keep up with the present. "Dad," Sarah said gently, her voice breaking the silence, "we need to know everything. The truth. You said you were part of an experiment, but you never told me who was behind it. You need to tell me more." Michael stopped pacing and turned to face her. His eyes were dark with regret. He knew what Sarah was asking. He knew the weight of the words, but the truth was something he hadn't fully grasped yet. It was buried deep in his memory, pieces scattered across time, just out of reach. But he had to try. He owed it to Sarah and Evelyn to tell them what he could. "There's so much I don't remember," Michael began slowly. "But what I do, remember, it's not easy to say. We were part of an experiment, a government project. They wanted to understand the anomaly, the way time was bending. They saw it as an opportunity, a weapon. They believed it could change everything." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Who are they? Who was behind it?" Michael hesitated. His mind seemed to struggle with the words, but he pushed through, knowing this was the moment he had to be honest. There was a group within, the government, a secret faction, part of the space agency. They weren't just scientists. They had military ties, people with power, with resources. They wanted control over the anomaly. They wanted to use it to manipulate time, to change history. "Change history?" Sarah echoed, disbelief filling her voice. "You're telling me they wanted to rewrite time?" Michael nodded grimly. "Yes. They believed they could go back in time, change events, and create a new reality. They wanted to control the future. But they didn't tell us everything. They only told us what they needed us to know. They kept the full extent of their plan hidden." "So you were a part of that?" Sarah's voice was soft, filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "You didn't know what you were getting into?" "I didn't know," Michael admitted. "We were just supposed to study the anomaly, not experiment with it. But once we were out there, once we encountered it, I realized too late what they were really after. The moment I passed through it, I felt something shift. My body. It wasn't just the physical effects. It was like I was being pulled apart and put back together again. That's when I started to feel younger, but I didn't understand it. I still don't. Sarah sat back in her chair, processing what he had said. The weight of the truth was heavy, almost suffocating. The government had been playing with forces beyond their understanding. They had used her father and countless others as pawns in their dangerous game. And now, Michael was paying the price for it. But there was one thing Sarah couldn't shake from her mind. If the anomaly could be used to change time, if it was really that powerful, what else could they do with it? I don't get it, Sarah said, her voice filled with frustration. If they were controlling it, if they knew what was happening, why would they let you go? Why let you come back? Michael's eyes flickered, a shadow of fear passing over his face. They didn't let me come back. I didn't come back by their choice. I think the anomaly did something to me. Something they didn't expect. I don't think they have full control over it, and that's why they're coming after us. What do you mean? Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. Michael's gaze shifted to the window, his mind clearly wandering. I don't think the anomaly just changes time. I think it's alive in some way. It's not just a force. It's a presence. And when I passed through it, it did something to me. I didn't just age backward. I became something different. It's like I'm a part of it now. But I'm not the only one. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? You're not the only one. There are others, Michael said quietly. Others who've been affected by the anomaly. Some have been turned into experiments, others have changed. But there's one thing they all have in common. They can't escape. They're all connected to it in some way. Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine. So there are more people like you, and they're being used by this faction, by these people in power? Michael nodded. Yes, and I'm afraid that if they find out what I know, if they realize I'm still alive, they'll come for me, for all of us. They won't stop until they have complete control. The room fell silent. The weight of Michael's words hung in the air. It wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about survival. And as Sarah looked at her father, this man who had come back to her only to be thrust into a new nightmare, she realized how much more was at stake. We can't let them win, Sarah said, her voice firm with determination. We have to stop them. We have to expose the truth. Michael looked at her, his expression serious. I'm with you, but we need to move carefully. They're watching us. They're always watching. Evelyn, who had been quiet up until this point, spoke softly. But how? How do we fight against something this powerful? Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. We find the others. We track down anyone who's been affected by the anomaly, anyone who knows the truth. We expose everything. It's the only way we stand a chance. Michael nodded, his face hardening. Then we start now. And so, they began to plan. They knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but together they would fight to uncover the truth and stop the secret faction before they could rewrite history. The days following their conversation were filled with a new kind of urgency. Michael, Sarah, and Evelyn had been on the run for so long that the idea of finding peace, even for a moment, seemed like a distant dream. They had uncovered enough of the truth to know what they were up against, but it felt like every step forward only led them deeper into danger. Michael's transformation, his return from the anomaly, and the hidden government faction were all pieces of a puzzle that had yet to be solved. But what haunted Sarah most was the feeling that they weren't just fighting to stop something. They were fighting to survive in a world where time itself had become a weapon. The cabin had become their temporary refuge, but it wasn't a place of rest anymore. It was a base of operations. They had to keep moving, keep looking for answers, but time was running out. The faction was closing in, and the truth about the anomaly was slipping further away from their grasp. One evening, as they sat around the table, Michael shared what he had discovered during his search for information. He had been trying to find out more about the other people who had been affected by the anomaly, the ones who had been caught in its strange pull. They weren't just victims. They were key to understanding the full scope of what had happened. "I've found something," Michael said, his voice low. He looked at Sarah and Evelyn. "There's a facility hidden deep in the mountains where they've been holding people like me, people who've passed through the anomaly. I think it's where they've been conducting their experiments. And I believe it's where they're keeping the answers we need." "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with doubt. "Is it really the place we've been looking for?" Michael nodded. "I'm certain. It's not just a research facility. It's a place where they've been testing the anomaly's effects. They've been using it to experiment on people, to manipulate time. If we can get there, if we can get inside, we can find the evidence we need to expose them. We can stop this." The idea of going to this facility filled Sarah with dread. They had been running for so long, trying to stay one step ahead, but now they had to walk right into the heart of the danger. It was a terrifying thought. But Sarah knew what had to be done. This was their last chance to put an end to everything. "We'll go," Sarah said, her voice firm. "But we need to be careful. We need a plan. We can't just walk in without knowing what we're up against." Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I know. We'll move quickly. Get in, get the information, and get out. We can't afford to waste any time." But Evelyn, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "What if we don't make it out? What if this is too dangerous? What if—" "We'll make it," Sarah interrupted, her voice strong. "We have to. There's no other choice." Evelyn hesitated but nodded, her face pale. She understood the stakes. She had seen enough of the danger they were facing to know that their lives were at risk. But she also knew that Sarah was right. They couldn't back down now. That night, they gathered what little they had, preparing for the journey ahead. Michael had some old military equipment hidden away, supplies that might help them get past any security at the facility. Sarah had been working on a plan, drawing maps and making sure they knew every route, every exit. But even with all their preparation, there was no guarantee they would make it out alive. The next morning, they set out. The journey to the facility took hours, and every minute felt like an eternity. As they traveled through the dense forest, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had never imagined she would be in a situation like this. Never imagined that her father would return, only to become part of something so dark and dangerous. But she had made a promise to herself, to her father, and to her mother. She would see this through, no matter the cost. When they finally reached the facility, Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. The place was hidden deep in the mountains, surrounded by tall trees and jagged cliffs. The building itself was a large gray structure set, apart from the rest of the world, as though it had been deliberately isolated. They approached cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they moved. The last thing they needed was to be spotted by the facility's guards. Michael led the way, his experience making him the perfect guide, even though his body was no longer the same as it had been. The anomaly had affected him in ways they still didn't fully understand, but it didn't matter now. They had a mission, and they had to finish it. "Stay close," Michael whispered as they reached the perimeter of the facility. "We don't know what kind of security they have inside." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the area. The tension in the air was thick, and the silence was deafening. They moved forward, making their way to the back of the building where Michael had noticed a small access point. As they crept through the darkened hallways, Sarah's mind raced. She knew they had to be quick. Every minute they spent inside was a risk, and the longer they stayed, the more likely it was that someone would discover them. They couldn't afford to be caught. After what felt like an eternity, They reached a large room at the center of the facility. Inside, they found what they had been searching for: rows of files, research notes, and video recordings. It was all there, everything they needed to expose the truth. Michael stepped forward, quickly, scanning the documents. "This is it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is everything they've been doing. The experiments, the manipulation of time, the people they've used. It's all here." But just as they were about to gather the evidence, a loud crash echoed through the building. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "They found us," she whispered. In that moment, Sarah realized that they had reached a point of no return. The truth was within their grasp, but getting out of the facility alive was another matter entirely. "Get ready," Michael said, his voice steady. "We have to fight our way out." And just like that, they were thrust into the final battle for their lives. With the evidence in hand, they made their stand. The choice was clear. They could fight and expose the truth, or they could run and lose everything. For Sarah, there was no choice. They had come too far to turn back now.